Close your eyes for a second. Now imagine this. You wake up, and everything is gone. Your house? Gone. Your phone? Doesn't exist. The roads, the buildings, the grocery store down the street, all of it, vanished. You're lying on the ground under a sky so thick with stars it looks fake. And the sounds are different. There's no hum of traffic, no distant sirens, no electrical buzz. Instead, you hear wind through grass, the crack of branches, and somewhere in the darkness a roar that makes your blood freeze. Welcome to 100,000 years ago. Now here's the twist. You're still you. Same brain. Same capacity to think, to feel, to create, but everything you relied on, every comfort, every convenience, every piece of knowledge stored in your phone instead of your head, gone. You have nothing but your body and your mind. How long would you last? A day? A week? Beyond of us would be dead before sunrise. But the humans who lived back then, they didn't just survive, they thrived. They raised children who grew into adults. They fell in love. They laughed. They created art. They told stories. They looked up at those same stars and wondered about their place in the universe, just like you do. They were you. They are you, just wearing different skin, speaking a different language, living in a world we can barely comprehend. And here's what nobody tells you. They weren't grunting cavemen. They weren't primitive brutes stumbling around hoping to get lucky. These people had skills that would make modern survivalists look like helpless children. They could create fire from nothing. They could read landscapes like you read text messages. They could track animals across miles of wilderness by looking at a bent blade of grass. They could identify hundreds of plants and know exactly which parts to eat and when. They made tools so sophisticated that archaeologists still study them, trying to figure out how they did it. But it gets even crazier. They had fashion. They had jewelry. They had beliefs about what happens when you die. They cared for the sick and elderly even when it cost them resources. They had complex social relationships, drama, alliances, probably gossip and humor. They had complex, deeply human culture that we'll never fully understand because it's lost to time. So, what were they really doing 100,000 years ago? That's the question we're about to answer. And I'm warning you right now, the answer is going to change how you see yourself, how you see human history, and maybe even how you see what we're capable of when everything's stripped away except our will to survive and our connection to each other. Because their world was brutal. Predators stalked them. Their climate tried to kill them. Death was everywhere. And yet they didn't just endure, they became the most successful species this planet has ever seen. This is their story. This is our story. And it starts with fire, fear, and a small group of people who refused to give up, even when the whole world wanted them dead. Let's get one thing straight right away. 100,000 years ago, the Earth was not a friendly place. Forget the romanticized images of peaceful hunter-gatherers strolling through sunny meadows plucking berries. The reality, our ancestors woke up every single day in a world actively trying to kill them. The climate was in chaos. We're talking about a period smack in the middle of what scientists call the late Pleistocene era, defined by wild temperature swings, advancing and retreating ice sheets, and environments that could shift dramatically within a single lifetime. In some regions, glaciers stretched across landscapes like frozen oceans. In others, deserts expanded and contracted with brutal unpredictability. Coastlines weren't where they are today. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet as water locked up in ice or flooded back into the oceans. And here's the kicker. Humans 100,000 years ago were mostly confined to Africa, with small populations beginning to venture into the Middle East and possibly beyond. But even in Africa, the cradle of our species' life, was no paradise. The continent experienced dramatic environmental shifts. Lakes appeared and disappeared. Forests gave way to grasslands and back again. Rain patterns changed. And with every shift came new challenges, different food sources, different water availability, different dangers. Speaking of dangers, let's talk about the neighbors. Humans weren't anywhere near the top of the food chain yet. Picture this. You're walking through tall grass at dusk, scanning for edible plants or tracking an animal, and suddenly you hear a low growl. Cave lions, massive predators that made modern lions look like house cats, prowled these lands. So did saber-toothed cats with canines that could puncture bone. Hyenas, but not the scavengers you might imagine. These were powerful pack hunters with bone-crushing jaws. And let's not forget the leopards, who had a particular fondness for ambushing primates including humans, but the predators were just one part of the equation. The megafauna of this era was staggering in size and temperament. Imagine trying to hunt or gather in an area frequented by woolly mammoths, each one weighing 6 tons and standing 13 feet tall, or encountering a short-faced baran, absolute unit of a predator that could run faster than a human and had the strength to bring down almost anything it wanted. There were giant ground sloths, massive wild boars, territorial hippos, and aggressive rhinoceros species. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and you became part of the food chain rather than someone exploiting it. So how did these humans, our direct ancestors, not just survive, but actually thrive enough to eventually spread across the entire planet? The answer lies in something that doesn't fossilize well: their minds. Because while they lacked claws, fangs, or thick hides, they had something far more powerful: the ability to think, plan, cooperate, and adapt. Groups were small, probably between 25 to 50 individuals in a typical band. This wasn't arbitrary, it was optimal. Too small, and he couldn't defend against threats or handle the workload of survival. Too large, and you'd deplete local resources too quickly and create social tensions that would tear the group apart. These bands were almost certainly related by blood or marriage, creating tight-knit social units where everyone knew everyone else intimately. Trust wasn't just nice to have, it was essential for survival. They were also nomadic, but not randomly. So, these weren't people wandering aimlessly hoping to stumble upon food. They moved with purpose, following seasonal patterns of plant growth, animal migrations, and water availability. They knew their territories, intimated every water source, every cave that could provide shelter, every grove of trees that produced edible nuts at certain times of year. This knowledge was accumulated over generations and passed down with meticulous care, because forgetting where the waterholes were during dry season could mean death for the entire group, and they had to be constantly vigilant. Imagine the mental exhaustion of never truly being safe. When you slept, someone had to stay awake to watch for predators. When you hunted, you had to be aware that you might become the hunted. When you gathered plants, you needed encyclopedic knowledge to distinguish between what would nourish you and what would kill you within hours. Every decision carried weight. Every mistake could be fatal. Yet despite these pressures, or perhaps because of them, humans developed an extraordinary suite of survival skills. They learned to read the landscape like a book. The behavior of birds could signal the presence of predators or lead them to water. The freshness of animal tracks told them how long ago prey had passed and which direction it was heading. The smell of the air, the color of plants, the position of stars, all of it became data, constantly processed and analyzed. They also became masters of risk assessment. When was it worth confronting a dangerous animal for its meat? When should they retreat? How much energy should they expend on a hunt versus gathering? These weren't simple calculations. They required understanding, probability, weighing costs and benefits, and making split-second decisions under pressure. And remarkably, they got it right, often enough, to not just survive, but to slowly, incrementally, expand their numbers and their range. Now, if you were dropped into that world with nothing but the clothes on your back, how long do you think you'd last? A day? A week? The truth is, without tools and knowledge, modern humans would be pathetically helpless in that environment. But our ancestors, 100,000 years ago, had something we've largely lost: an intimate relationship with technology, not the digital kind, but the primal kind that meant the difference between eating and starving, between warmth and freezing, between life and death. Let's start with stone tools, because this is where things get fascinating. By 100,000 years ago, humans had long since moved past the crude, chunky hand axes of earlier hominins. They were now creating sophisticated implements using a technique called prepared core technology, or Livawa technique, if you want to get technical. Here's why this matters. Instead of just bashing rocks together and hoping for the best, they were pre-planning their tools. Picture a craftsman, let's call him. Ko is sitting with a carefully selected piece of flint. He's already examined it, knowing from experience which types of stone will work and which will crumble uselessly. He begins by shaping the core, removing flakes in a specific sequence, creating a surface with a predetermined shape. Then, with one precise strike, he detaches a flake with sharp edges and a specific form: a scraper, a knife, a spear point. This isn't luck, this is engineering. It requires spatial reasoning, planning several steps ahead, and fine motor control. It requires teaching and learning, because you don't figure this out by accident. And these weren't single-use items. A well-made stone blade could be used, resharpened, used again. When it finally wore down to nothing, every fragment would be utilized for something: cutting, scraping, piercing. Nothing was wasted because everything was precious. But stone tools were just the beginning. Our ancestors 100,000 years ago were masters of composite technology, combining multiple materials to create tools greater than the sum of their parts. They hafted stone points onto wooden spears, using organic adhesives made from tree resins mixed with ochre and sometimes charcoal. Think about what that represents. They understood chemistry at an intuitive level. They knew which tree saps were sticky, how to heat them to the right consistency, what additives would make them stronger and more durable. They created bindings from sinew or plant fibers, wrapping them with precision to ensure the point wouldn't come loose at the critical moment of impact. These spears weren't just pointy sticks. Some evidence suggests they were balanced for throwing, others were designed for thrusting. They likely had different weapons for different prey: lighter spears for smaller game, heavier ones for dangerous animals that you needed to stop before they got too close. And this meant they understood physics, trajectory, force, momentum. They might not have had the vocabulary for it, but they understood these concepts in their bones, refined through countless generations of trial and error. Then there's fire. Oh, fire. If there's one technology that truly separated humans from other species, this was it. By 100,000 years ago, fire wasn't a lucky accident. They tried to maintain they could create it on demand. The most common method was probably a bow drill or hand drill, spinning one piece of wood against another until the friction created an ember. But this wasn't as simple as it sounds. You needed dry wood of the right types. Some woods work, others don't. You needed tinder that would catch from a tiny coal, dried grass, plant down, fungus prepared specifically for this purpose. You needed to know how to feed that ember, how to breathe life into it without extinguishing it, how to build it into a flame and then a fire. And once you had fire, everything changed. Suddenly the darkness held less terror because you could push it back. Predators, whose eyes reflected the firelight from the shadows, were wary of flames and often kept their distance. Fire meant warmth, which meant you could survive in colder climates, extend your range, wait out cold nights that would otherwise be deadly. Fire meant cooked food, which is huge. Cooking breaks down tough plant fibers and meat, making nutrients more accessible and killing parasites and bacteria. There's even evidence that cooking allowed human brains to grow larger over evolutionary time, because we could extract more calories from less food. But fire was also social glue. The hearth became the center of community life. It's where people gathered as darkness fell, where stories were told, where tools were made and repaired, where the old taught the young. It's where relationships deepened and culture was transmitted. The fire wasn't just a tool, it was the heart of what it meant to be human. Water was another constant concern. Humans need water every few days at most, and finding it in changing landscapes required incredible knowledge. They learned to read the environment. Certain plants only grew near water sources. Animals created trails leading to arrows. The flight paths of birds in the evening could lead you to where they drank. They knew which roots and plants could provide moisture when surface water was scarce. They likely created containers from gourds, animal bladders, or tightly woven baskets sealed with resins to carry water with them, allowing them to range further from reliable sources. Shelter was equally critical. When you can't just go home and lock the door, you need to get creative. Caves were used when available, but they were prime real estate and often already occupied by less friendly creatures. So humans built shelters. Archaeological evidence from around this time shows they constructed windbreaks, lean-tos, and possibly more sophisticated structures using branches, hides, and whatever materials were available. They chose locations strategically, near water, but not so close they'd encounter predators also drawn there, with good sightlines to watch for danger, sheltered from prevailing winds. And here's something we often forget. They had to do all of this while dealing with injuries and illness. A sprained ankle that would have you hobbling around your house for a week could be a death sentence then. A bad infection could spread unchecked. Yet there's evidence they understood basic wound care using plants with antiseptic properties. creating primitive bandages, possibly even setting broken bones. The survival rate might seem grim by our standards, but the fact that they survived at all is a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. So we've established that the world was dangerous and that our ancestors had tools to deal with it. But what did they actually do all day? How did they spend their time? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of daily survival 100,000 years ago, because it's more complex and interesting than you might think. First, let's address a common misconception. The term hunter-gatherer makes it sound like hunting and gathering were equally important. They weren't. In most environments, gathering the collection of plant foods, insects, eggs, shellfish, and other relatively stationary food sources provided the majority of calories. Some estimates suggest that 60 to 80% of the diet came from gathered foods, not hunted meat. This wasn't because hunting wasn't valued. It absolutely was. But hunting is unpredictable, energy-intensive, and dangerous. You can spend an entire day tracking an animal and come home with nothing. Gathering, on the other hand, is more reliable if you know what you're doing. And our ancestors, 100,000 years ago, definitely knew what they were doing. The plant knowledge alone was staggering. They could identify hundreds of plant species and knew which parts were edible and when. Roots in spring, berries in summer, nuts in fall. Each season brought different foods. They knew which plants were edible, raw, and which needed processing. Some plants required soaking, pounding, or roasting to remove toxins. Others could be eaten immediately. They understood that the same plant could be food in one season and poison in another as chemical compositions changed. Women likely did most of the gathering, not because of some primitive sexism, but because it made practical sense. Gathering was something that could be done while pregnant, while nursing, while watching young children. And make no mistake, this wasn't easy work. It required walking miles every day, often over rough terrain. It required strength to dig up deep roots, to climb trees for fruit or honey, to carry heavy loads back to camp. It required constant vigilance, because even while gathering, you needed to watch for dangers. And it required an encyclopedic knowledge base that took years to acquire. The women who gathered weren't just collecting food. They were the primary breadwinners, the ones who kept the group fed day in and day out. Their knowledge of the landscape, of seasonal cycles, of which areas would have what foods, this was invaluable intelligence that determined where the group would travel and when. But hunting was the high-risk, high-reward gamble, and it was necessary, not just for food but for materials. Animal hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools and needles, sinew for bindings and thread, fat for energy and for making those adhesives. We talked about organs that provided concentrated nutrition. When a hunt succeeded, it was a windfall that could feed the entire group for days and provide materials for weeks. Men typically did most of the hunting, probably because they weren't constrained by pregnancy and nursing, and because the dangers of hunting meant it was strategically better not to risk the reproductive core of the group. But this wasn't some rigid division. Evidence suggests flexibility based on skill, circumstances, and necessity. Hunting 100,000 years ago was probably a mix of strategies. Persistence hunting, where you track an animal for hours, or even days, following it until it's exhausted while you, with your superior endurance and ability to cool yourself through sweating, are still going strong. This works particularly well in hot climates where animals overheat faster than humans. Ambush hunting, where you use your knowledge of animal behavior to predict where they'll be and lie in wait. Cooperative hunting, where the group works together to drive animals toward a kill zone or separate a weak individual from the herd. And it was dangerous. Going up against large prey with nothing but sharpened sticks and stones meant getting close enough to be gored, trampled, or mauled if things went wrong. Every hunt required careful planning. Who would do what? What were the backup plans if the animal charged? How would they approach without being detected? They had to think like the animals they hunted, predict their reactions, exploit their weaknesses. The hunters also had to manage their own energy carefully. Track-in could take you far from camp, and you needed enough energy to make it back, even if the hunt failed. You had to decide when to give up on a trail and try something else rather than exhaust yourself chasing shadows. You had to balance ambition with prudence, because an injured hunter was a burden on the entire group. After a successful hunt came the processing, butchering the animal efficiently, distributing the meat, preserving what couldn't be eaten immediately. They likely smoked or dried meat when possible, extending its usefulness. They rendered fat, saved hides, collected bones. Nothing went to waste, because waste meant suffering later. But here's what might surprise you. For all this focus on survival, people 100,000 years ago probably had more leisure time than you do. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest they might have worked, that is, spent time on food acquisition and processing only 3 to 5 hours a day on average. The rest was spent on social activities, tool maintenance, storytelling, playing, resting. This wasn't a life of constant desperate struggle. Despite the dangers, it was a life with different priorities, different rhythms. The key was efficiency and knowledge. When you know exactly where to find what you need, when you've perfected your techniques over a lifetime, when you work cooperatively with people, you trust implicitly, you can meet your needs without grinding yourself into exhaustion. The desperation we imagine often comes from modern people, trying to survive with primitive tools, but without the knowledge base. Our ancestors had that knowledge. It was their inheritance, their education, their most valuable possession. They also understood something we've largely forgotten: how to live within the carrying capacity of their environment. They didn't deplete resources because they'd be back next season, and they needed those resources to still be there. They moved before they'd stripped an area bare. They understood, probably intuitively rather than consciously, the concepts of sustainability that we're now trying to relearn. So when you picture humans 100,000 years ago, don't imagine constant panic and desperation. Imagine competence. Imagine people who understood their world intimately, who had the skills to thrive in it, who faced dangers with courage and planning rather than fear. Imagine people who, despite living in a world that wanted them dead, had figured out not just how to survive, but how to live. Here's where things get really interesting and, honestly, a bit mysterious. We can dig up stone tools and analyze bones, but how do you excavate a thought? How do you carbon date a belief? How do you find fossils of love, fear, wonder, or hope? You can't. And yet, if we're going to understand what humans were really doing 100,000 years ago, we need to grapple with the hardest question of all. What was going on inside their heads? Let's start with what we know for certain, anatomically. The humans alive 100,000 years ago were us. Same brain size, same brain structure, same cognitive potential. If you could somehow transport a baby from that era to today and raise them in a modern environment, they could learn calculus, play piano, write poetry, code software, whatever. The hardware was there, but the software, the cultural programming, the accumulated knowledge, the ways of thinking and believing, that was completely different. And yet, there are glimpses, tantalizing pieces of evidence that suggest the inner lives of these ancient people were far richer than we might assume. Take ochre, for example. Ochre is a natural pigment, an iron clay that ranges from yellow to deep red, and humans 100,000 years ago were obsessed with it. We find ochre at archaeological sites from this period all over Africa and the Middle East. They were mining it, processing it, and transporting it over considerable distances. Now, why would you do that? Ochre has some practical uses. It can be part of adhesive mixtures. It might have mild antiseptic properties. It could be used as a rudimentary sunscreen. But the quantities we find suggest something more. The processing methods, grinding it into powder, mixing it with other substances, suggests intentionality beyond mere utility. The most compelling explanation: they were using it for symbolic purposes, for decoration, for art, for ritual. Imagine a woman carefully grinding ochre on a flat stone, mixing it with fat until she has a paste, then using her fingers or a primitive brush to apply patterns to her skin, or perhaps to the skin of someone else in the group, marking a coming of age, a successful hunt, a union between partners. These marks would say something: who you were, what you'd accomplished, what role you played in the community. They would transform a simple body into a canvas carrying meaning. This might seem like a small thing, but it's monumental. Symbolic. Thinking the ability to let one thing represent another is foundational to everything that makes us human. Language is symbolic. Sounds represent concepts. Art is symbolic. Marks on a surface represent objects, emotions, ideas. Ritual is symbolic. Actions represent beliefs and values. If humans 100,000 years ago were engaging in symbolic behavior, They were thinking in fundamentally modern ways, and there's more evidence. Around this time period, we start seeing the use of beads and ornaments, shells with holes deliberately made in them, suggesting they were strung together as jewelry. Why wear jewelry? It's not functional in a survival sense, doesn't keep you warm, doesn't help you get food, doesn't protect you from predators, but it's deeply functional in a social sense. It announces identity. It can signal status, achievement, group membership, or aesthetic preference. It says, I care about how I'm perceived. I have a sense of self that extends beyond just being a biological organism. Think about what that means for consciousness. These weren't automatons simply responding to stimuli. They had an understanding that others perceived them and that these perceptions mattered. They were thinking about thinking, aware of being aware. That's a sophisticated level of cognition that we often reserve for advanced civilizations, but it was already there, flickering in firelight, adorning buddhis with shells and ochre. Language is another piece of the puzzle, though here we're on shakier ground because language doesn't fossilize. But consider the complexity of life 100,000 years ago, the tool-making, the hunting strategies, the plant knowledge, the social coordination would have been nearly impossible without sophistication. Communication. You can't teach someone to make a liverwire call with just hand gestures. You can't plan a cooperative hunt with grunts and pointing. You can't transmit knowledge about which plants are poisonous and which are nutritious across generations without language. The genetic evidence is suggestive too. Modern humans have versions of genes like FOXP2, associated with language ability, that differ from those in other primates and even from Neanderthals. These genetic changes were in place well before 100,000 years ago, suggesting our ancestors had the biological equipment for complex language. How complex? We can't know for certain, but probably quite complex. Grammar, syntax, abstract concepts, stories, questions, negotiations, arguments, jokes, all of it was likely possible. And if they had language, they had stories. This is where we enter the realm of speculation, but informed speculation. Stories are universal across all human cultures. They're how we make sense of the world, how we teach, how we bond, how we entertain ourselves. Did they tell stories 100,000 years ago? Almost certainly. Stories about great hunts, about dangers narrowly avoided, about ancestors long dead, about the origins of their world. Maybe, and this is where it gets really speculative, but fascinating. They told stories to explain what they didn't understand. Why does the sun move across the sky? Why does rain fall? What happens when we die? The origins of religious and spiritual thinking are lost in the mists of time, but the cognitive capacity was there, the tendency to see patterns, to infer agency, to imagine unseen forces. These are deeply embedded in human psychology. It wouldn't be surprising if some proto-religious ideas were already forming. Maybe they believed spirits inhabited certain places or animals. Maybe they had origin stories for their group. Maybe they performed rituals they believed would bring luck in the hunt or protect them from harm. What we know for sure is this: the humans of 100,000 years ago were not intellectually primitive. Their brains were just as capable as ours. They were curious, creative, and conscious. They wondered about their world and their place in it. They had interior lives as complex and vivid as yours, or mind filled with hopes and fears, memories and anticipations, relationships and rivalries. They were, in every way that matters, fully human. Now let's talk about something that might be the most important survival tool of all: each other. Because humans 100,000 years ago didn't survive through strength or speed or natural weapons. They survived through cooperation, through forming bonds so strong that they would literally risk their lives for one another. The social world of our ancestors was intricate, intense, and absolutely essential. Start with the basics. A band of 25 to 50 people. Everyone knows everyone else intimately, their strengths, their weaknesses, their moods, their histories. There's no anonymity, no privacy, the way we understand it. You're born into this group. You grow up surrounded by these faces, and if you're lucky, you grow old with them still around you. These aren't just your community. They're your entire world. Kinship would have been the organizing principle. Most people in your band would be blood relatives or related through partnership bonds. Your mother, father, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins. These relationships defined your place in the social structure. But kinship wasn't just about biology. It was about obligation and support. Your relatives had claims on you, and you had claims on them. If you made a big kill, you shared with family first. If you were sick or injured, family cared for you. This reciprocal obligation was the foundation of survival. Pair bonding, what we might call romantic relationships or marriage, was almost certainly a feature of life 100,000 years ago. Humans are unusual among primates in forming long-term pair bonds, and the evolutionary pressures for this were likely already in place. Raising human children is incredibly resource-intensive. They're helpless for years and don't reach full maturity until their teens. Having two parents invested in their survival dramatically increases the odds of those children making it to adulthood. But these weren't necessarily the romantic partnerships we idealize today. Practical considerations would have been paramount. Does this person contribute to the group? Are they skilled, strong, healthy? Can they be trusted? Romance and attraction probably played a role. Humans are humans. After Albert's survival came first, and relationships would have been more public than private. Everyone knew everyone's business. Conflicts between partners were community concerns, because discord could threaten group cohesion. Children were likely raised communally to some degree. Yes, parents would have primary responsibility for their own children, but aunts, uncles, grandparents, and even unrelated adults would have participated in childcare, teaching, and protection. This makes sense when you think about it. If a parent dies or is injured, the child still has caretakers, and having multiple adults involved in raising children means more eyes watching for danger, more teachers passing on knowledge, more emotional support. And this brings up something remarkable that we see evidence for: care for the vulnerable. We find skeletons from around this time period showing individuals who survived serious injuries or injuries that would have required extended care from others, broken bones that healed, indicating months of recovery during which that person couldn't have contributed much to the group's survival. Individuals who lived to old age despite missing teeth, and having arthritis that would have made food gathering difficult. Why does this matter? Because it shows compassion, empathy, a willingness to support group members even when they couldn't pull their weight. In a purely calculating survival sense, abandoning the injured or elderly would free up resources for the more productive members. But humans didn't do that. They cared for each other. An elderly person might not be able to hunt anymore, but they held decades of knowledge, of stories, of wisdom. They were living libraries in a world without writing. A child who broke a leg might need months to heal, but they represented the future of the group, the continuation of the community. This care extended to death itself. There's evidence from around this time period of intentional burial practices. Now, burial could just be pragmatic dead bodies attract scavengers and create health risks, but some burials show signs of being more than just disposal. Bodies placed in specific positions, sometimes with ochre sprinkled on them, occasionally with objects. This suggests ritual, suggests belief in something beyond the immediate physical reality. Imagine a group grieving one of their own. Maybe it's a hunter killed by a lion, or a mother who died in childbirth, or an elder who simply reached the end of their years. They dig a pit, hard work in many soils, with only stone tools. They place the body carefully, perhaps positioning it in a way that holds meaning for them. They mark the grave, perform some ritual, share memories. This isn't just hygiene. This is acknowledging that the person mattered, that their loss leaves a hole in the social fabric. The emotional lives of these people would have been intense in ways we might struggle to understand. You couldn't just move to a new city if you had conflict with someone. You couldn't choose a new friend group. You were stuck with these people, for better or worse. So social skills mattered enormously. Reading emotions, managing conflicts, maintaining alliances, showing appropriate deference, or asserting authority at the right times, all of this required sophisticated emotional intelligence. Gossip probably played a huge role. In small groups, with no written records, reputation was everything. Information about who was trustworthy, who was generous, who pulled their weight, who shirked responsibilities. This flowed through the group constantly. Gossip served a regulatory function, reinforcing social norms and punishing free riders without necessarily requiring direct confrontation. Leadership existed, but probably not in the formalized way we think of it. There were no kings or chiefs. with absolute power. Instead, influence was earned through competence, through generosity, through good judgment. The best hunter might have influence over hunting decisions. The elder with the most knowledge of plants might guide gathering expeditions. Some with good interpersonal skills might mediate disputes. Power was fluid, contextual, and always provisional. And let's talk about something we rarely consider: humor and play. Just because life was hard doesn't mean it was joyless. Humans have a remarkable capacity to find lightness even in difficulty. Children played, learning critical skills through games that mimicked adult activities, practicing, throwing, tracking, tool-making. Adults probably played too, competing in tests of skill, telling funny stories, engaging in that particularly human pleasure of laughing together. Music might have existed too. The human voice is an instrument, and rhythmic clapping or striking objects together requires no technology. If language existed, and we're pretty confident it did then, singing almost certainly did too. Imagine the evening around the fire. Someone begins a rhythmic chant, others join in, bodies sway together. It's bonding, it's joy, it's beauty in a harsh world. The social world of 100,000 years ago was complex, nuanced, and deeply human. These weren't isolated individuals struggling alone against nature. They were interconnected communities where relationships were everything, where your survival depended on your bonds with others, where care and cooperation outweighed individual advantage. In many ways, they were more socially connected than we are, their lives woven together in patterns of mutual dependence we've largely lost. So we've established that humans 100,000 years ago had the cognitive capacity for symbolic thinking and complex social relationships. Now, let's venture into the most mysterious territory of all. What did they believe? What happened in those minds? As they stared into the fire at night, as they faced death, as they tried to make sense of a world full of wonder and terror. We need to be careful here. We have no written records, no detailed archaeological evidence of belief systems from this exact time. What we do have are hints, suggestions, the bare bones of what might have been elaborate systems of thought. We can combine this fragmentary evidence with what we know about human psychology and about belief systems in more recent hunter-gatherer societies to make educated guesses. But that's what they are, guesses. Informed, reasonable, but still speculative. That said, let's start with something foundational. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine. We evolved to detect patterns because pattern recognition kept us alive. That rustle in the grass could be wind, or it could be a predator, and the humans who assumed predator and ran survived, more often than those who assumed wind and stayed put. This means our brains have a bias. They'd rather see patterns that aren't there than miss patterns that are. We're primed to see faces in clouds, to hear voices in wind, to infer intention and agency even in random events. This cognitive quirk is probably the root of magical and religious thinking. When something happened, good or bad, the human mind wants to know why. Not just the mechanical cause, but the meaning, the purpose, the agent behind it. Why did that hunter get killed? By a lion, but not this one. Why did we find water when we desperately needed it? Why did the child recover from illness? Without scientific frameworks for understanding causation, the mind fills in the gaps with stories that make sense within the cultural context. It's entirely plausible that humans 100,000 years ago had developed some form of animistic beliefs, the idea that animals, plants, places, and natural phenomena had spiritual essence or agency. This kind of thinking is common across human cultures and makes intuitive sense in a world where you're deeply dependent on nature. The animals you hunt aren't just meat. They're beings with their own intentions. That grove where you always find food isn't just geography. It's a special place, maybe blessed, maybe inhabited by some presence. Think about what it would feel like to live so intimately with nature. You watch animal behavior constantly, and they seem to have awareness, purpose, personality. The old bull elephant seems wise. The leopard seems cunning and malicious. The river provides life, but can also kill. These aren't inert resources. They're participants in your world. Why wouldn't you think they had some form of consciousness or spirit? And if animals and places have spirits, maybe those spirits can be influenced. Maybe there are things you can do, actions, words, offerings, that will make the hunt successful, or the rains come, or the illness go away. This is the beginning of ritual behavior, not necessarily formal religion with priests and temples, but personal and communal practices meant to influence forces beyond immediate control. That ochre we talked about earlier, it might have been ritual, marking someone before a hunt to invoke protection or success, marking a grave to honor the dead or guide their spirit. We can't know exactly, but the care with which it was prepared and used suggests it meant something beyond simple decoration. Dreams probably played a significant role in belief formation. We know humans have always dreamed. It's a function of our neurology. And dreams are weird. In dreams, you can fly. The dead return to life. Impossible things happen. For people without a neurological explanation for dreaming, what would you conclude? Maybe that dreams are another kind of reality. Maybe that there's a spirit world you visit when you sleep. Maybe that the dead aren't really gone but exist somewhere else, somewhere you can sometimes see them. Death itself would have demanded explanation. One moment, a person is alive, breathing, moving, talking. The next moment, they're not. The body is still there, but the person is gone. Where did they go? What happened to the essence that made them who they were? Every culture we know of has tried to answer this question. It's hard to imagine humans 100,000 years ago didn't grapple with it too. Maybe they believed the dead went to some other place. Maybe they thought spirits lingered near the living. Maybe they believed in some form of rebirth or transformation. We don't know. But those burials with their careful positioning and ochre suggest death was more than just the end of biological function. It was an event that required ritual response. The natural world must have inspired awe and fear in equal measure. Thunder and lightning, with no understanding of atmospheric electricity, would seem like the acts of some powerful force. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, solar eclipses, all of these would demand explanation. Were they warnings? Punishments? Just the nature of the world. Different groups probably developed different stories to explain what they experienced. And here's something crucial. These beliefs, whatever they were, would have been communally shared and reinforced. When everyone around you believes certain things, when the stories you hear from childhood all incorporate the same basic worldview, those beliefs become simply how the world is. There's no alternative framework to compare them to. The distinction between belief and knowledge would have been blurry or non-existent. You don't believe the sun will rise tomorrow. You know it will. Similarly, they might not have believed in spirit. They knew spirits existed because that's how their world worked. These belief systems, whatever their specifics, served important functions. They provided explanations for the inexplicable. They offered a sense of control, or at least influence, over uncertain outcomes. They reinforced social norms. Maybe certain behaviors pleased the spirits or ancestors. Maybe others angered them. They provided comfort in the face of death and loss. They created shared meaning and identity for the group. But let's not romanticize this too much. We don't know if these belief systems were gentle or harsh, liberating or constraining. Belief can inspire great compassion or justify terrible violence. It can bring communities together or tear them apart. Without specific evidence, we can't say whether the beliefs of humans 100,000 years ago made them happier or more moral or better in any objective sense. We can only say that they almost certainly believed something beyond pure material reality. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. We're the species that asks why, even when the answer is unknowable. We create meaning even when there might not be inherent meaning to find. We tell stories to make sense of chaos. We see the world not just as it is, but as we imagine it could be or should be. That capacity for imagination, for abstract thought, for looking at reality and seeing something more that was already there, flickering in the minds of people. Around fires 100,000 years ago, they looked up at the stars we look up at. They wondered about the same big questions we wonder about. They tried to understand their place in a vast, mysterious universe. And in doing so, they were fully, completely, recognizably human. Let's talk about mastery. Not the kind you get from reading a book or watching a YouTube tutorial, but the deep, embodied knowledge that comes from doing something thousands of times, from being taught by someone who learned from someone else across generations. The humans alive 100,000 years ago were masters of their crafts in ways that would put most of us to shame. They had to be. Their lives depended on it. We touched on fire earlier, but let's really dig into what fire mastery meant. By 100,000 years ago, Humans didn't just use fire opportunistically when they could find it from lightning strikes or volcanic activity. They could create it, control it, and use it in sophisticated ways that transformed their relationship with the environment. Creating fire on demand is harder than you think. Try it sometime with primitive methods and you'll gain instant respect for your ancestors. The most reliable method was probably the bow driller system, where you use a bow to rapidly rotate a wooden spindle against a wooden base, creating friction that generates heat. But this isn't just spinning wood mindlessly. You need the right wood species for both the spindle and the base board. The spindle needs to be harder than the base, but not too hard. The wood needs to be dry but not brittle. You need a socket stone to hold the top of the spindle and apply downward pressure without burning your hand. You need a notch carved precisely in the baseboard where the ember will form, and that's just the equipment. The technique requires coordination, rhythm, the right amount of pressure, and most importantly, patience. You spin until you see smoke, until the friction creates a coal that glows in the char dust accumulating in your notch. Then onward. This is where many attempts fail. You need to carefully transfer that tiny ember to your tinder bundle. Not just any dried grass will do. You need material that's been prepared, fluffed to maximize airflow, arranged in a nest shape. You place the ember inside, fold the tinder around it gently, and blow not too hard, not too soft, introducing oxygen to feed the combustion until suddenly you have flame. How many times would you have to fail at this before you succeeded? How many times did the first humans who figured this out fail? But by 100,000 years ago, this knowledge was established. Children would have watched adults create fire hundreds of times before trying it themselves. They'd have been taught which woods to use, how to prepare materials, what the smoke should look like, how the ember should glow. This wasn't just skill, it was curriculum, a body of knowledge meticulously preserved and transmitted. Once you had fire, the real mastery began. Controlling fire, keeping it at the right temperature, in the right location, for the right duration, require constant attention and deep knowledge. Too hot, and you waste fuel and risk burns, or starting wildfires. Too cool, and you don't get the benefits you need. Different tasks require different fire management. Cooking needs steady, moderate heat. Keeping warm overnight needs a fire that burns slow and long. Hardening wooden spear points requires intense, focused heat, applied carefully to avoid burning through the wood. Creating those pitch adhesives for Houghton tools requires heating tree resin to just the right temperature. Too hot, and it becomes brittle. Too cool, and it won't bond properly. And then there's the fuel management. You can't just burn any wood. Some woods burn hot and fast, good for cooking. Others burn slow and produce long-lasting coals, good for overnight fires. Some woods produce thick smoke, useful for smoking meat or signaling, but unpleasant for fires you're sitting around. Green wood versus seasoned wood burns completely differently. They knew all of this not from experimentation but from inherited knowledge refined over countless generations. Stone tool manufacture was another arena of true mastery. We mentioned Liverwire's technique before, but let's appreciate what this actually entailed. You're looking at a piece of raw stone, say, flint or obsidian or chert. You need to be able to read that stone. You need to see the grain structure, identify any flaws or inclusions that might cause it to fracture wrong, envision the finished tool hidden inside that raw material. This is three-dimensional spatial reasoning at a high level. Then comes the shaping process. You're using a hammerstone, carefully selected for its properties, to strike flakes off your core. Each strike needs to be precise. Angle of impact, force of blow, location of strike, point. Strike wrong and you shatter the whole piece, wasting hours of work and precious material. Strike right and you'll remove exactly the flake you intended, moving one step closer to your goal. The nap of the toolmaker is performing a kind of sculpture, but one where every strike is irreversible. There's no undo button. You can't add material back. Every decision compounds on previous decisions. You're not just making one tool, you're preparing a core that will yield multiple tools, planning several steps ahead like a chess master, visualizing future moves. And here's what's truly remarkable. Studies of stone tools from this period show them to be remarkably consistent. Flakes of similar size and shape, points with proportions that repeat across different specimens. This isn't random bashing producing lucky results. This is standardized production. This is people who had a mental template for what they were making and the skill to reproduce it reliably. They were manufacturing two specifications without tape measures or blueprints, using only their knowledge in their hands. Different people probably specialized to some degree. Some individuals might have been particularly talented knappers, and the group would recognize and utilize that talent. Others might have been expert at fire management or at identifying useful materials in the landscape. This early specialization meant skills could be developed to higher levels, and that the group as a whole had access to better tools and resources than if everyone had to be equally mediocre at everything. Teaching these skills was critical. A master napper working on a tool would have been surrounded by others watching, learning. Apprentices would have started with simpler tasks, maybe roughing out the initial shaping, while experts handled the delicate final work. Mistakes were learning opportunities. A broken point meant discussing what went wrong, what to do differently next time. Knowledge flowed not through formal classrooms but through observation, practice, correction, and gradual mastery. The tools themselves tell stories. We can look at stone tools from 100,000 years ago and see the hammer strikes, identify where the napper made adjustments, spot the moment they fixed an error. These aren't just artifacts. They're frozen moments of problem solving, evidence of human minds working through challenges, applying knowledge, exercising creativity within constraints. And these skills weren't static. There's evidence of innovation, of techniques being refined over time. The toolkit was evolving, slowly but perceptibly, as people discovered better methods or adapted tools to new environments and new challenges. This wasn't blind tradition, mindlessly repeated. It was living knowledge, tested and improved with each generation. Now let's talk about something that doesn't leave artifacts behind, but was perhaps the most sophisticated skill of all: ecological intelligence. The ability to read the landscape, to understand the complex web of relationships between plants, animals, weather, seasons, and terrain. This was knowledge that meant the difference between thriving and starving, between safety and danger. Imagine you're walking through an unfamiliar area with someone who lived 100,000 years ago. To you, it's just wilderness trees, rocks, grass, maybe some animals in the distance. To them, it's a text written in a language they've been learning since childhood, and they can read every line. They notice things you'd never see. The broken branch isn't random. It shows the direction and approximate size of an animal that passed through. The freshness of the break tells them how long ago. The height suggests what kind of animal. They're building a mental map of the area, noting the movements of game animals, predicting where those animals might be based on time of day, season, and available food sources. They read the plants with equal sophistication. That tree over there, it'll have nuts in 2 moons. Those roots, edible right now, but toxic in the dry season. That cluster of flowers, it means there's water nearby, because that species only grows where groundwater is close to the surface. They know hundreds of plant species, which parts are edible, which are medicinal, which are poisonous, and crucially, how all of that changes. Throughout the year, the knowledge base required for competent plant foraging is staggering. You need to identify plants at all stages of growth: seedling, mature, flowering, fruiting. You need to know which parts are edibles. Some plants have toxic leaves but edible roots, or vice versa. You need to know preparation methods. Many plants are poisonous, raw but safe after processing. Acorns, for example, are incredibly nutritious but contain tannins that need to be leached out through repeated soaking and draining. Without that knowledge, you'd eat them once and never make that mistake again. With that knowledge, you have access to a calorie-rich food source that stores well and is abundant in many environments. They understood animal behavior in ways that seem almost supernatural to us. They knew that certain birds followed bees to hives, so following those birds could lead you to honey, a precious source of concentrated calories. They knew which predators hunted at what times and adjusted their activities accordingly. They understood migration patterns, breeding seasons, territorial behaviors. This allowed them to predict where animals would be and when, turning hunting from random chance into strategic planning. Weather prediction was another critical skill. They couldn't check a forecast on their phone, but they could read the signs: cloud formations, wind direction, animal behavior, plant responses. All of these told them what was coming. A particular kind of sunset meant rain tomorrow. Ants building their mounds higher meant a wet season approaching. Birds flying low suggested a coming storm. This knowledge helped them plan when to stay put, when to move, when to seek shelter, when to take advantage of good conditions. Navigation, in a world without maps or GPS, required remarkable spatial memory and environmental awareness. They would have used multiple methods: solar navigation during the day, stellar navigation at night, landforms as reference points, the position of prevailing winds, plant distributions that varied with geography. They could travel across vast territories and find their way back to specific locations at cave system. That grove of nut trees, that reliable water source 7, after months away. Seasonal knowledge was perhaps the most complex layer of their environmental understanding. Everything changed with the seasons, and tracking these changes was essential. It would have known that as days lengthened, certain plants would sprout, that first rains would trigger the blooming of specific flowers and the emergence of certain insects, that animal migrations would begin when particular stars appeared in the night sky. They were thinking in cycles, understanding that the world moved through predictable patterns, and that survival meant synchronizing your activities with those patterns. Water finding was a skill that could determine life or death. In arid environments especially, knowing how to locate water was critical. They learned to read topography. Water flows downhill and accumulates in low areas. They learned plant indicators. Certain species only grew where groundwater was accessible. They learned animal patterns following game trails that often led to water sources. They could dig in dry creek beds where water might be just below the surface. They could extract moisture from certain plant roots or collect dews before sunrise. They also understood ecology in a holistic way that we're only now beginning to appreciate again. They knew that certain plants grew in association with others, that certain animals indicated the presence of certain habitats, that disturbing one element of the ecosystem would have cascading effects. This wasn't abstract environmental science. It was practical knowledge, essential for not depleting the resources they depended on. Tracking was an art form. Expert trackers could look at footprints and tell you not just what animal made them, but how old the tracks were, whether the animal was male or female, young or old, healthy or injured, walking or running, alone or in a group. They could track animals across diverse terrain: rocky ground where prints were faint, through water where most sign was obliterated, across hard-packed earth where only the subtlest disturbances remained visible. With this tracking knowledge extended to tracking humans as well. They could tell individuals apart by their footprints, the pattern of wear, the distinctive gait, the size and shape. This had obvious applications for finding lost group members, or being aware of other human groups in the area. The sophistication of this ecological knowledge can't be overstated. Modern humans dropped into that environment without this knowledge. Base would be helpless. We might have the same cognitive capacity, but we lack the accumulated wisdom, the trained perception, the intuitive understanding that came from living immersed in that world every day from birth. And all of this knowledge was oral, stored in human memory, and transmitted through demonstration and storytelling. There were no field guides to consult, no reference books to double-check. Every bit of information had to be memorized, practiced, and internalized until it became second nature. The human mind was the database, and remarkably, it was enough. Here's the thing that's easy to miss. Everything we have cities, technology, art, science, all of it rests on foundations laid by people tens of thousands of years ago. The skills and knowledge systems developed by humans 100,000 years ago weren't just survival tactics. They were the building blocks of human civilization. They were figuring out, piece by piece, how to not just survive, but to actively shape their world. Take shelter construction. We've talked about seeking natural shelters like caves, but humans were also building structures. Archaeological evidence from various periods suggests that even without metal tools, humans could construct sophisticated shelters. They would have started with simple windbreak stacked stones, or woven branches that deflected wind and provided some protection from the elements. But the principles learned from these simple structures would have been foundational. Understanding structural stability, load distribution, material properties. They selected locations strategically. Good drainage was important. You don't build where water accumulates. Orientation mattered, positioning the entrance away from prevailing winds, situating the shelter to catch morning sun for warmth. Proximity to resources was a consideration. but so was safety not too close to animal trails or water sources where predators congregated. The materials they used show sophisticated understanding of their properties. Branches need to be flexible but strong. Hides need to be properly prepared to be what stones need to be stable and interlocking. They were, in essence, doing engineering without the formal mathematics, using intuitive understanding of physics principles that they'd absorbed through experience. Clothing represents another massive technological achievement that we completely take for granted. Making clothing from animal hides is complex. First, you need to hunt and kill the animal, already a major undertaking. Then comes the skinning, which needs to be done carefully to avoid damaging the hide. The hide then needs to be processed, cleaned of remaining flesh and fat, treated to prevent rot and make it supple. This likely involved scraping with stone tools, possibly treating with animal brains or other substances that help soften the leather. Then came the actual construction, using bone needles themselves, sophisticated tools requiring careful shaping, and the drilling of an eye small enough for thread but large enough not to break. They would have sewn pieces of hide together using sinew or plant fibers as thread. The patterns would have been learned and refined over generations. How to cut the hide to minimize waste, how to shape pieces that would fit a human body and allow for movement, how to reinforce areas subject to stress. And clothing wasn't just functional. We have reason to believe it was also expressive. Even simple decorative elements, shells sewn onto leather, patterns made with ochre, careful stitching that created visual design showed that people cared about how they looked. Function and aesthetics weren't separate concerns. They were integrated. Food preservation was another critical innovation. Fresh meat spoils quickly, especially in warm climates, but humans figured out multiple methods to extend the usability of food. Drying meat in the sun or by fire turned it into a form that could last for weeks or months. Smoking meat not only preserved it, but also added flavor and created a barrier against insects and bacteria. They might have used salt when available in certain regions. They learned which plant leaves could wrap food and help preserve it. This knowledge meant that a successful hunt didn't just provide food for a few days, but could supply protein for extended periods. It meant they could build up reserves for lean times. It fundamentally changed the relationship between effort and reward, between feast and famine. The concept of the toolkit itself represents sophisticated thinking. Rather than carrying every tool they might need, impossibly heavy and impractical, they learned to carry a core set of tools that could be used to create other tools as needed. A good knife could shape wood into spear shafts. A hand axe could work leather, process plants, break bones to access marrow. This is modularity, the understanding that generalized tools plus knowledge can be more powerful than specialized tools for every task. They also developed container technology. Carrying capacity dramatically affects your range and effectiveness. Without containers, you can only carry what you can hold in your hands or arms. With containers, woven baskets, animal bladders, shells, hollowed gourds, who can transport water, carry gathered food, bring materials back to camp for processing. This seemingly simple innovation multiplied productivity enormously. Navigation over long distances suggests they had developed mental mapping abilities and possibly physical markers. They ranged across territories spanning hundreds or even thousands of square kilometers, yet could return to specific locations reliably. Some researchers believe they might have created trail markers or had communal knowledge of routes and landmarks, a kind of oral cartography passed down through generations. The knowledge systems they developed were cumulative and progressive. Each generation didn't start from zero. They inherited the accumulated wisdom of all previous generations, and they added to it new techniques, new discoveries, solutions to new problems. This cultural evolution, this ability to build on the past, is uniquely human and incredibly powerful. They were also beginning to modify their environment in small but meaningful ways. Controlled burning of vegetation, for example, was probably already being practiced in some regions. This wasn't just accidental fire. It was intentional landscape management that promoted the growth of desirable plants, created better hunting conditions, and reduced the risk of catastrophic wildfires. They were beginning to engineer their environment rather than just accepting it as given. And perhaps most remarkably, they were teaching all of this. Every skill, every piece of knowledge, every technique had to be transmitted to the next generation or it would be lost. They developed pedagogical methods without formal schools, learning through doing. through observation, through storytelling, through patient correction of mistakes. A child learning to knapstone would start with easy material and simple tools, progressing over years to more difficult work. A young hunter would accompany hunts long before participating in the kill, learning by watching, absorbing the strategies and techniques. The patience required for this teaching is worth appreciating. A skilled craftsperson could make a tool much faster alone than while teaching a clumsy learner, but they taught anyway because they understood something fundamental. Knowledge not passed on is knowledge lost forever. They were investing in the future, ensuring their community would persist and thrive beyond their own lifetimes. So when we ask what humans were really doing 100,000 years ago, part of the answer is this: they were building the foundation for everything that would come after. They were developing technologies, accumulating knowledge, refining skills, and most importantly, creating systems for preserving and transmitting all of this across generations. They were the architects of human possibility, figuring out step by step what our species could become. So here we are, 100,000 years later, and what have we learned about our ancestors? That they were us fully, completely, recognizably human. They loved and feared and hoped. They created beauty and meaning in a harsh world. They mastered skills we've forgotten and possessed knowledge we're only beginning to relearn. When you look up at the stars tonight, remember that they did too. When you gather with people you love around warmth and light, remember that they did the same around fires we'll never see. When you face uncertainty and fear but push forward anyway, remember that they faced far more with far less and persevered. We exist because they survived. Every breath you take is a testament to their resilience, their ingenuity, their refusal to give up even when everything was stacked against them. The blood in your veins flowed through theirs. The brain in your skull is built on the same template as theirs. We are not separate from them. We are their continuation. And maybe that's the most important thing to carry away. From this journey into deep time, we're all connected, not just to each other now, but to every human who came before us, all the way back to those small bands huddled against the darkness, making tools by firelight, telling stories to children who would carry those stories forward into an unimaginable future. They couldn't have imagined you sitting where you are right now, learning about them, but they made you possible. They deserve to be remembered, not as primitive ancestors we've transcended, but as the remarkable, fully human people they were. So the next time someone casually dismisses ancient humans as simple or primitive, you'll know better. You'll know that 100,000 years ago, humans were doing something extraordinary. They were surviving, thriving, thinking, feeling, creating, and laying the groundwork for everything we've become. If you found this journey through time as fascinating as I did putting it together, consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate seeing our ancestors in a new light, and maybe spend a moment today appreciating the long, unbroken chain of survival and knowledge that connects you to those fires 100,000 years ago, because their story isn't just history, it's your story too.